Have you ever wondered about what makes Apple Apple as distinguished from Android? And do you know how Apple uses psychology to maintain their status in the minds of consumers and people that are interested in their products? You know, how do they keep customers willingly in the walled garden, as they call it sometimes, of the Apple ecosystem? Stick around at the end of this video and you'll understand why and how companies draw on design, technology, and culture to capture customers and to create loyalty in some of the most unlikely places. Welcome to another episode of This Anthro Life podcast, brought to you in collaboration with Culture Capitalist. I'm your host, Adam Gamwell. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about the concept of a cultural moat. Now, we're borrowing this idea from the idea of an economic moat, which was popularized by billionaire investor Warren Buffett. And an economic moat refers to a company's capacity to sustain a competitive advantage in the marketplace against other organizations or companies. A cultural moat, slightly differently, gives a company a competitive edge through the cultural beliefs and practices of the company, the customers and stakeholders, and everybody that's kind of in an organization's ecosystem. So it can have economic implications, and often does, because customers might be more loyal, for example. They want to evangelize and tell their friends about a product or a service they love, but it also does something else beyond just economics. And companies often will build these cultural moats through the value and the meaning of their brands and products to consumers. And this happens when companies think beyond just the use value of a product, what it does for somebody, or the functional value, and they think about how it can contribute to people's lives in a more holistic way. So talking across like functional, economic, social, and emotional levels. Now, companies with strong cultural moats tend to have very distinctive brands. They have loyal customers and a societal impact that sets them apart from other companies. So for example, Disney has a rabid fan base, devotees we might say, who form a subculture that are so well known as a unique group that they've become the subject of serious academic scholarship and studies. They have shaped political discourse, and they've influenced culture globally. Cultural value is built over time through effective experiences and narratives between an organization, a company, and consumers. And while Disney's cultural value is often tied to nostalgia and customers' memories, like imagining a magical childhood, right? Apple is more often associated with envisioning how technology is shaping the future. Now, the cognitive processes for remembering the past and imagining the future are powerful, and they're also closely related to one another. And so we see these companies have used these neurological processes to help them create especially impactful cultural moats. Now, there's a lot to cover when discussing cultural moats, so let's start with an example that's been in the news lately. If you have an iPhone, you've probably texted somebody using Apple Messages, right? Now, Apple is known for providing an integrated user experience across its hardware and software products. An iPhone works really well with a Mac or an iPad. And this reinforces the perception that the company goes beyond creating gadgets to helping customers maintain a way of life or a lifestyle. It's effective because it goes beyond just this kind of technical functionality that makes an iPhone and a Mac work together. And the thing is, Apple's cultural moat includes a symbolic ecosystem. Now, one deceptively simple example of the symbolic ecosystem comes from the Messages app. Now, iPhones are known for color coding messages depending on whether or not they're sent from iPhones. What that means is, if you're an iPhone user and you receive a message from another iPhone user, who we might think about as cultural insiders, the messages are blue bubbles. Right? Now, if you receive a text message from other kinds of phones like Android, your messages are in green bubbles. It's important to recognize that Apple's making a symbolic move here. It is a design choice to have green and blue bubbles, but when we dig deeper, we can actually see some interesting underpinnings at play here. So one of the things that you may not be as aware of is that Apple has been public about its plans to add support for rich communication services, which is a type of way of using multimedia messaging, things like typing notifications, read receipts, high-resolution media sharing, and also better security like encryption when communicating with non-iPhone users. So what this means is that all these features might sound familiar if you're working from one iPhone texting to another. You can see when someone's typing, you can see read receipts, you can send high-resolution images, but that doesn't work very well between Android and iOS. Now, what's interesting is that Android has adopted this system in 2019, so 5 years ago at this point. Apple still has yet to quite do this. So while the adoption of rich communication services across the iOS line will make a meaningful difference on a technical level for communicating between Apple and non-Apple devices, it's likely that Apple's going to keep the color coding of their text because of how important the symbolic communication is to Apple's cultural strategy. They still want you to see and feel that difference between communicating between iPhones and non-Apple devices. And wouldn't you know it, that companies want to get a little bit of that blue bubble market share. And as a result, there has been an ongoing quest to bring blue bubbles to Android devices with multiple companies competing for different strategies. Here's just a few companies that spell out the blue bubble saga. In 2018, AirMessage was the first significant attempt to bring blue bubbles to Android devices. Now, their solution required a Mac computer to act as a relay server. Users had to install server software on their computer, which forwarded their messages to Android devices, and it was cumbersome, right? Users had to make sure their Macs were always on and connected to the web, as well as in having a different phone. Next, there was a company called Blue Bubbles, and they attempted to improve on the approach taken by AirMessage, and this was accomplished by eliminating the need for having that continuous connection through their Mac, but the requirement of a Mac-based server still limited adoption. Next up was a company called Sunbird, and Sunbird introduced an app that brought iMessage functionality to Android devices without the need for an Apple device as a relay. Now, their approach simplified the setup process with the goal of making it compelling to a broader audience. However, their solution was still technically challenging and hard to put together, and there's a ton of reliability issues, and a lot of features were still unavailable between Android and iOS. Continuing the saga, there was a company called Nothing that makes the Nothing phone, so I'm not talking metaphysically here, and they partnered with Sunbird to create Nothing Chats, and this allows Android users to send messages to iPhones through Blue Bubbles, as long as they have a Nothing phone and share their Apple ID with the service. However, the service faces the same reliability issues as Sunbird's standalone app, and there's security concerns that come along with users having to share their Apple ID with a third party. And then finally, there was Beeper Mini, which you may be familiar with. This is an app that connected directly to Apple's servers and allowed users to send and receive Blue Bubble messages without needing an Apple ID or a relay server. Big no-no, right? Beeper Mini also offered end-to-end encryption, addressing the privacy concerns with the previous solutions. Now, Beeper Mini was the most technically impressive and user-friendly option, and this is perhaps why Apple acted the most swiftly against them. You see, Apple disabled Beeper Mini's integration with Apple Messages, citing security concerns. Beeper eventually had to concede defeat and shut down the app and service. Now, this incident drew the attention of regulators and lawmakers. The U.S. Department of Justice, which was already conducting an antitrust investigation into Apple, expanded its probe to include the company's reaction to Beeper Mini. And several politicians have called for an investigation into Apple's practices, arguing that they might be anti-competitive. So while Apple's strategy demonstrates how much successful companies value their cultural moats, it also reveals the risks that they have to take to protect them. All right, this has been a whirlwind tour so far, and we'll discuss how organizations build cultural moats in follow-up conversations. But one useful perspective that I want to leave us with in this context around Apple's green and blue bubbles is semiotics. Now, semiotics is the science of signs and symbols. And blue and green text bubbles have strategic value to Apple because of their symbolic meanings to American iPhone users. Now, in the corporate world, semiotics is often discussed in terms of residual, dominant, and emergent cultural phenomenon. That means ideas that have been sticking around for a while, that they're residual, the dominant ones that are capitalizing and shaping mainstream thinking, and emergent are the new ideas that are kind of coming down the pike, shaping subcultures that may become mainstream one day. In semiotics in general, we'll go beyond this framing, but this is often how people are introduced to semiotic concepts, especially through business and marketing. So that's why I wanted to pay attention to them today. Now, one of the important things to think about this as well is that symbolic meanings tend to change with culture. And the thing is, culture is changing faster than ever. So for example, think about how the symbolic meaning of a blue check mark on Twitter has changed over the years. And even Twitter's cultural moats have undergone dramatic changes just in the last couple of years. As you know, there's a new owner and there's a new company name. It's been a little bit crazy. So at a time when culture seems to be changing day by day, Apple's ability to keep the blue and green bubbles at the core of its cultural moat is especially noteworthy. And thank you as always for joining me on the pod today. If there are other companies and organizations, topics, or ideas that you'd love for us to explore in this series, do not hesitate to reach out. You can get me on social media, over email, on the website, or on our Substack. I always love being in conversation with you, and you make the show worth it. Thanks for sticking around. You're listening to or watching This Anthro Life, and I'm your host, Adam Gamwell. We'll see you next time.